Almost 10 million accounts exist on the Hedera network. 10 million. And when you find out how many of those accounts are actually active on any given day, you're going to realize something that I think genuinely changes how you see your own position. Because if that number surprises you, and it will, it means the bar for being in the genuinely elite tier of HBAR holders is a lot lower than most people assume, and a lot of people are sitting closer to it than they think. Before we continue, if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Now let's get back to the topic. So here's the thing I gotta say up front, before anything else. Because I think honesty about this specific point is what makes the rest of this video actually useful, instead of just exciting. So HBAR's wallet distribution data is genuinely less precisely published than XRP's. XRP has clean, specific, regularly updated percentile thresholds you can pull from on-chain explorers, with specific coin counts per tier. 46,323. XRP puts you in the top 1% published, verified, specific. HBR doesn't have that same level of precisely documented percentile breakdown available in one clean, reliable public table. And I'm not going to make up a fake precise number to fill that gap, because I think made-up precision is actually more dangerous than an honest range. What I am gonna do is build you the most honest, well-reasoned estimate of where those lines actually sit, using every real verifiable data point we have. And then I'm going to show you why the picture you get from doing that, honestly, is actually more interesting than a fake precise number would be anyway. Because there's a twist in this HBAR data that I think almost nobody in this space is talking about. And once you see it, the how much puts me in the top 1% question looks completely different than you'd expect. So let's start with the foundation, what we actually know. The Hedera network has approximately 9.78 million total accounts created as of the most recent data available. Total circulating supply sits at roughly 43 billion HBR. The maximum fixed total supply is 50 billion tokens, meaning about 86% of the total is now in circulation. Current price is somewhere in the 7 cents to 9 cents range, depending on when you're watching this, with an all-time high of $0.5692 set back in 2021. Market cap sits around $3 billion, and the fully diluted valuation, accounting for all 50 billion tokens, is around $3.5 billion. Now here's the number that actually changes this entire conversation. Of those 9.78 million accounts, the estimated number of daily active wallets, accounts that are actually doing something on any given day, sits somewhere between 2,000 and 18,000, depending on which analysis methodology you use. Conservative estimates from Q3 2025 put it at around 2,069. More optimistic Q1 2026 forecasts stretch it up to 18,000. Either way, you're talking about somewhere between 0.02% and 0.2% of all accounts that are actually active on any given day. Take a moment and sit with that. Nearly 10 million accounts exist on any given day. Somewhere between 2,000 and 18,000 of them are doing anything at all. That means somewhere between 99.8 and 99.98% of all Hedera accounts are sitting dormant on any specific day. The gap between accounts existing and accounts being actively used is one of the widest of any network in the top 30 crypto assets. Now, I know what some people watching this are thinking right now. That sounds terrible. Why would I want to be in the top 1% of a network with almost no daily active users? And I get that reaction, but I think it's actually reading the data backwards. What the daily active wallet number mostly reflects is that Hedera is primarily an enterprise-facing network, not a retail DeFi playground. Enterprises using Hedera for supply chain data, insurance rails, logistics tracking aren't showing up as daily active wallets the same way a Solana user swapping meme coins every 20 minutes does. The enterprise transactions don't necessarily flow through the kind of wallet that appears in the daily active wallet count. So maybe a lot of what looks like wallet inactivity is actually enterprise usage happening through different channels. But here's why it still matters for the top 1%. Question. The 10 million account figure includes enormous numbers of essentially empty or near empty accounts created for various reasons but never really used. That inflates the denominator of the top 1% calculation in a way that makes the actual elite tier smaller in absolute numbers than it would be on a network where nearly every account has meaningful holdings. And here's why it matters so much for the top 1% question. Specifically, when we talk about being in the top 1% of HBR holders, we're talking about the top 1% of roughly 9.78 million accounts. That's the top 97,800 accounts. But the meaningful frame isn't really about all 10 million accounts, the majority of which are dormant, many of which were created during promotional campaigns or ecosystem grants, many of which hold essentially zero. The more useful frame is how do you compare against people who are actually meaningfully, actively holding and engaged with this asset. And that frame is actually much more reachable than the raw 10 million account number suggests. Let me build the estimate from the supply side, because that's where the most reliable data sits. And 43 billion HBR is circulating. If we take the available whale tier data, we know the single largest known individual whale wallet holds somewhere around 3 billion HBR, which is about 6% of total supply. That's already dramatically more concentrated at the top than a single wallet usually gets credit for in casual conversation. But it also tells you something important. HBAR's biggest wallet at 6% is far less concentrated than XLM's Stellar Development Foundation at 41%, or XRP's 6 escrow wallets each at 5% apiece. The top of HBR's distribution is actually the flattest of the three major ESO 20,022 payment coins. So the supply that might crush your potential ownership stake isn't sitting in one big foundation wallet the way it is on mine. Stellar, broader whale tier estimates, wallets with meaningfully large positions, put something like 55% of circulating supply in larger addresses. That's real. It's meaningful concentration, but it's a broader, more diffuse group than a single entity controlling it all. Now, let's actually build the tiers. I'm going to be clear that these are derived estimates, not a published table, because nobody should pretend otherwise. There's one more real data point worth anchoring this in before we build the tiers. Roughly 29% of total HBAR supply is actively staked across the network right now. That's about 12.5 billion HBR sitting in staking positions, not just passively held in wallets. That tells you something meaningful of the accounts that are actually engaged with this asset. A very large share has taken the time to stake, to delegate their tokens to a node and start earning that roughly 2% annual reward. Staked holders are, by definition, more deliberate, more long-term oriented, and more informed about the network than dormant account holders. And 12.5 billion HBR sitting in staking positions across an unknown number of wallets gives you a reference point for where serious engaged holder territory starts, even without a precise percentile table. With 43 billion tokens in circulation across roughly 10 million accounts, the simple average, if distribution were even, would be around 4,300 HBR per wallet. But crypto distributions are never even, they follow power law curves. which means a massive number of accounts hold very small amounts, and a tiny number of accounts hold enormously large amounts. Based on what we know from comparable networks, from on-chain analytics firms that track HBAR specifically, and from the supply concentration data. So here's the most honest picture I can give you. The bottom 80-90% of HBAR accounts almost certainly hold less than 1,000 HBAR. Each, at today's price, that's under $70 minus 90. These are the kind of positions that get created during exchange, sign-up bonuses, airdrop campaigns, ecosystem grants, early curiosity purchases. Many of them have never moved, which is consistent with the daily active wallet data, showing most accounts sitting completely dormant. The top 20 to 30% of accounts would likely start somewhere around $1,000 HBR and go up from there. In dollar terms, at current prices, $1,000 HBR is somewhere around $70 to $90. For comparison, XRP's top 10% threshold is somewhere around $2,200 to $2,400 XRP, which at XRP's price of around $1.20 is roughly $2,600 to $3,000. HBAR's equivalent tier entry sits at a much lower dollar figure simply because of the price differential per coin, even though the coin counts look wildly different. You're looking at roughly the same order of magnitude in dollar terms. And for the absolute elite tier, the top 0.1%, based on the same curve, you're likely looking at 1 million to 10 million HBAR or more. At current prices, 1 million HBAR is $70,000 to $90,000. 10 million is $700,000 to $900,000. Those are genuinely large positions, and the concentration data we have for HBAR's biggest known wallets, some of which run into the billions, tells you what kind of institutional and corporate scale holdings sits at the very top. Now, before I lose you in the coin counts and dollar figures, I want to address something that is actually the most important and least discussed part of the HBAR wealth picture. And it's the reason being in the top 1% of HBAR and means something very different than what it might mean on, say, Ethereum or Solana. There is what analysts specifically call a value accrual gap on Hedera, and I think understanding this gap is actually more important for an HBAR holder than knowing their exact percentile. On most networks, with meaningful staking programs, transaction fees flow in ways that directly benefit token holders, either through token burns that reduce supply or through direct fee distribution to stakers. And both, Hedera works differently. Transaction fees on the network are priced in fixed USD terms, which is genuinely useful for enterprises because it means predictable costs that don't fluctuate with the token price. But those fees flow to node operators and the Hedera treasury rather than concentrating directly as financial returns to HBAR stakers in a proportional way. This creates a scenario described by analysts covering the network, where Hedera could scale its transaction volume significantly without necessarily producing explosive token appreciation, because the connection between network usage and token demand isn't as direct as it is on networks where fees are burned or directly distributed to stakers. The staking yield you earn by delegating HBR around 2% annually comes from the staking rewards account, not from the fee revenue generated by network usage. Your coins earn more coins, which is genuinely valuable, but it's not the same as a dividend directly tied to the network's commercial success. That's not a criticism of Hedera's design. The predictable fee structure is specifically what makes it attractive to enterprises who need to budget transaction costs without worrying about fee volatility. It's a deliberate architectural choice that serves a specific institutional audience. But For HBAR holders trying to understand why hasn't my HBAR position generated returns, even though the network has lots of transactions, this is the honest structural explanation. And this actually loops back to the tier question in an interesting way, because the top 1% of HBR holders, whoever sits in that 100,000 to 500,000 coin range, is not earning meaningful passive income from the network's commercial activity the way top stockholders in a profitable company would through dividends. They're earning staking rewards from a treasury pool. The upside case for those holders is almost entirely built on price. Appreciation driven by institutional adoption, eventually creating HBR demand that shows up in the actual token market, not from fee revenue flowing directly to holders. This means that a top 1% HBR holder and a top 1% XLM holder are in structurally different positions, even if their raw dollar values are similar. Because XLM's biggest argument has been becoming infrastructure for stablecoin and tokenized asset settlement, where the network usage drives demand for the token. Whereas HBAR's biggest argument has been enterprise credibility and institutional adoption. That may or may not ever translate into token demand, depending on whether enterprise users need to actually hold HBR on the open market to use the network, or whether they can access it through institutional channels without creating significant retail buy pressure. The daily active wallet number I gave you earlier, 2,000 to 18,000 out of almost 10 million accounts, is actually the most honest reflection of where HBR sits right now in that journey. The enterprise partnerships are real. The Canary ETF is real. The McLaren Racing Council membership is real. The FedEx logistics integration is real. The State Farm and Geico Insurance Consortium is real. All of those things are happening, but the daily active wallet count being where it is suggests that most of the network's account holders are still waiting for that enterprise activity to translate into something they personally feel in their own wallets rather than already experiencing it. So what should you actually take away from all of this as an HBAR holder trying to calibrate where you sit? First, the honest range. If you're holding somewhere around 10,000 to 50,000 HBAR, you're likely in the top 10 to 20% of all Hedera accounts, a meaningful position in a network with nearly 10 million accounts. If you're holding somewhere around 100,000 to 500,000 HBR, you're very likely in the top 1% in the elite tier by any reasonable estimate of how this distribution works. And if you're holding a million HBR or more, you're in the top 0.1% or above. Genuinely whale territory by any measure. Second, the dollar reality at current prices of 7 cents to 9 cents, 100,000 HBR. The rough lower end of a top 1% estimate costs somewhere around $7,000 to $9,000 to build. That's not pocket change, but it's not a hedge fund number either. It's the kind of position a disciplined retail investor could build over 1 to 2 years of consistent accumulation if they're serious about it. And here's the part that I think genuinely matters for how you frame this for yourself. If HBAR ever returned to its all-time high of 56 cents and 100,000 HBAR becomes $56,000. If it hits $1, which would require a market cap of roughly $43 billion, matching what major altcoins have reached in previous cycles, 100,000 HBR becomes $100,000. These are not predictions. They're just the math of what the tiers mean at different valuations. And seeing them laid out makes the why does being in the top 1% matter question a lot more concrete than just the percentile ranking on its own. The tier you're in doesn't change. The value of that tier changes with the price. The third thing that matters more than the tier itself, the tier tells you where you sit in the distribution of accounts. It tells you nothing about whether the enterprise adoption thesis eventually closes the value accrual gap, drives real HBAR demand, and produces the kind of price appreciation that makes any of those tier calculations feel meaningful in hindsight. The only honest answer to that question, the only one that actually determines whether being in the top 1% of HBR holders ever pays off, is that it depends on whether the network's commercial activity eventually starts pulling real capital through the token rather than bypassing it through enterprise channels that don't touch the open market. The technical foundation is real. The partnerships are real. The zero daily fee comparison to Ethereum or Solana is real. The regulatory clarity is real. And what's still an open question, and I want to be genuinely honest that it is still an open question, is whether and how fast the gap between enterprise activity and actual HBR market demand closes. If it closes, the position math changes dramatically. If it doesn't, you're holding a well-designed network's token that just never quite connected its commercial success to token value at the scale people hoped. That's the honest HBR Rich List. Not a fake clean number, not a guaranteed outcome. The real data, the honest gaps in that data, the structural context that makes it make sense, and the actual question that determines whether those tier positions ever mean what HBR holders are hoping they will. If going through this honestly, including the parts that most HBAR content skips, is more useful to you than a fake, precise number with no sourcing behind it, hit like. It genuinely helps put this kind of honest breakdown in front of more people instead of content that just makes up a clean tier table and calls it research. Subscribe if you want this level of honesty on the HBAR story as it keeps developing, including when something actually changes in the value accrual picture, because that's the update that would actually matter most for every tier we just talked about. Drop a comment and tell me where you actually sit roughly in the tier ranges I laid out. And more importantly, tell me whether you thought about the value accrual gap before today, because I think that's actually the piece most people in this community have the most useful things to say about, if they've been in this long enough. And if you know somebody who's been tracking their HBAR bag by coin count without ever understanding why coin count and dollar return don't always move together the way they might on other networks, send them this video, because that's the conversation this community needs to be having. More honestly, have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to join my free Telegram community with the link on my channel where I post my daily crypto experience and arbitrage opportunities you can't get anywhere else. This is XRP Holbert signing off.